My name is Isabelle McConville, and I am a bookseller and associate producer here at Barnes& Noble. And Lucy Steeds is a name you've probably already heard. And if not, it's one you will want to remember. The Artist in the Feast was longlisted for the 2025 Women's Prize for Fiction, the winner of the Waterstones Debut for Fiction Prize, and a finalist for the Barnes& Noble Discover Prize. This book is making waves, and for good reason. Lucy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, can you please set up the story of your book for us?
Sure. So it is set in the south of France over the long, hot summer of 1920. And it follows three people. Firstly, we have the reclusive but nonetheless famous artist Edouard Tartuffe, and he lives secreted away from the world in this isolated farmhouse down this path that no one treads. And the only other person who lives in this house with him is his niece Etty. And she just works silently to make sure that the master, this painter, can work. And so their lives have rolled on seamlessly, quietly like this for a while until one day a stranger comes to town, and that stranger is Joseph. And he is a journalist intent on writing a piece about this reclusive, secretive painter, and he's determined to crack why this man has hidden himself away from the rest of the world. And so you then have this summer where these three people are stuck in this house together, all trying to suss each other out. And gradually, as the summer rolls on and it gets hotter and stickier, Joseph realizes that there is actually a much more interesting story under the roof of this house, and perhaps he's not even asking the right questions or looking at the right things. So it's these three people circling each other and stripping away each other's secrets.
I just love what you do with character in this book. I mean, just thinking about Joseph. Oh, sweet Joseph. We'll get back to him. But I wonder if there's any moment you can pinpoint when you knew you had these three characters and you knew you wanted this to be your book. Like, do you remember the spark?
I do, but unfortunately, I remember really clearly the spark for this book, and it was one of the twists. And it's a really interesting thing where I can't talk about it in interviews, because the thing that hooked me was this idea. And I had this idea as being one of the twists. There are a few little twists and turns. They might not even necessarily be twists as more reveals in the book. And I think that's an important distinction. I see a twist as a change that is an answer to a question you were not even asking. And a reveal is more of an answer to a question you were asking. And there are these reveals throughout the book. And yes, one of these revelations was what initially hooked me. And it's one of the key themes of the book. But to talk about it would sort of be to reveal too much. And it's a really interesting thing where my agent, when we were going out to publishers initially, we were really thinking carefully about how to pitch this book, because my agent summed it up by saying, the hook is the twist. And it's one of those things where if you want a snappy one-word concept of what this book is, it is unfortunately one of the secrets that's buried at the heart of the book. So we had to find ways of framing the book that would lead you down that path but not ruin what was at the end of it. So that was one of the sparks. And that was a really quick spark. But there were, of course, other things that set my mind thinking about this. And one of them was, yes, just these three people in this house. And what I really love about this is that these three people are different depending on who they are bouncing off against. So Etty, she's very subservient and quiet around her uncle, but then she unfurls and comes alive, and is also quite spiky sometimes towards Joseph. And I just love this idea that I think of it as like a jewel where, depending on what light refracts off which angle, different things spark off it. So I love this thing of putting these people in this house together and just ramping up the tension and the temperature and seeing what happened, really.
I love what you said about Etty and how she tends to be a bit prickly around Joseph. I love that she's kind of prickly. I think that we really get to know her so well through the book, but you do it, like you said, with these little revelations throughout the novel. You do start us off with her in a museum. Can you tell me about starting the book right there and why you chose to do that?
Yes, and that sort of functions as a prologue. So the majority of the novel takes place in 1920, but then there's this little prologue from 1957 at the beginning. And I love prologues. I know prologues are controversial. Some people don't like them, but it goes back to this idea of the question that you're asking as you read the book. And I wanted to set up this question where you have this scenario at the beginning, this person in a museum, and she is looking at a painting that she knows does not exist, or that shouldn't exist. And it's because as the reader moves through the book, I never wanted the question to be what. I never wanted it to just be what happens next. I wanted the question to be how. How do we get to this place at the beginning? And I wanted that moment at the beginning to constantly be in the back of your mind as just an extra layer for the book. So you can think, well, one plot is happening, but I know we have to arrive somewhere else by the end. And how do we get there? And it's that question of how. And I'm a big believer in prologues. I love them because it's that theory of suspense. You know Hitchcock's theory of suspense? His theory is that thing of suspense is not two people sitting at a table and all of a sudden a bomb comes through the window and explodes. That's not suspense. That's surprise, sure, but it's not suspense. Suspense is two people sitting at that same table, and you, the viewer, he's talking about film, so the viewer can see under the table there is a bomb, and you know the bomb is going to go off at 12 o'clock, and you can see a clock on the wall that says 11:59. That is suspense. And the difference between those two scenarios is that you have more information in the latter scenario. So I love this idea of feeding strange clues, and then the question is what? And it kind of goes back to that Greek theory of storytelling. You know, Greek dramas, Greek plays, thousands of years ago, the structure of a Greek play is that the chorus comes on first, and they introduce the story to you, and they say, here's what's going to happen. And they tell you everything that's going to happen in the play, and then they leave, and you stay for the next 3 hours and you watch the play unfold, because the question in your mind is, well, how can that come to pass? How does this happen? And you see it time and again. So I mean, like Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare does the same, where in the prologue he says they both die. And it doesn't make the play any less tense or intriguing, because you're watching the play going, but how do we get to that point where these two people are dead by the end? And a lot of my favorite stories do it. So, you know, The Secret History by Donna Tartt.
Oh, yes.
That begins, I mean, the first line is like, the snow had been melting in the mountains and Bunny had been dead for several days before we realized the gravity of our situation. So you know from like line 1 that Bunny is dead. And then you read the rest of the book, and every time Bunny is in a scene, you're like, is this where he dies? And it actually overlays the story with so much more tension and ominous portent than there otherwise would be. So I really like this framing device of giving you a little bit of information and a little bit of intrigue at the beginning, and then sinking into the story. And you always have this question of, but how do we get there?
I love that. That really speaks to me just individually as a reader, because when it comes to things like spoilers, for example, I don't mind them so much personally when I'm going into a book or like for a TV show or for a movie, because I know I'm in here for the experience. So my idea is if a spoiler truly spoils the entire experience for you, then maybe you didn't do something right. Because that experience is what makes reading so visceral. It, you know, I could look up a plot summary and not feel anything, you know, like what you do with language and what you do with just igniting the senses as we read makes this such an incredible experience, especially when you get to the end and you finally put that last puzzle piece together and you're like, wow, that's what was going on this whole time. It's just incredible.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad it's an enjoyable experience throughout. I mean, that was all I cared about. And you're right, that you could look up a plot summary, but there's a reason that's not the same experience as reading the book. The experience of the book is the ride, not the destination. So I really wanted it to be, a pleasurable experience going in. Because I also think there are some like quite heavy themes in this book. It's like touches on some important things about, you know, art, love and war and things like this. But I was so aware that in writing it, it had to be a good time. It also had to be a fun romp as you went through it. And you would never get to the important ideas or questions if you weren't turning the pages.
You also have this book structured into named parts, which I loved. I won't get into the names of the parts just for fear of giving too much away, but did you know that that's how you wanted to write the book from the start? And also, do you usually write things as we read them?
So I use the three-act structure to form this book into a
Mhm.
shape because in a way this book it could easily be very formless because it's just this one house, and you had to create sort of a dynamic momentum to the story because they don't really leave this house, and I
Mhm.
had to find a way of moving these characters through a story. And so by giving it these three parts, 3 months, it just takes place over one summer. You have these 3 months, and I plotted these crescendos and these questions and answers that loop themselves throughout the book. Did I know exactly how the structure would turn out at the beginning? No. And I mean, I'm sure you speak to many writers who all say, yeah, the structure changes so much. And it's this interesting puzzle where I knew the shape of the story, but I didn't know the way that all the individual bits were tied up. So everything at one point was in a different place in the novel. And this is the giant headache of editing, which is that if you move one puzzle piece, you have to be aware of all the ripple effects and all the ways in which that changes the rest of the story. And a lot of storytelling is sitting down and saying, okay, what is the effect of putting this incident before this one? And ideally, I mean, I'm really gratified that it feels now like the story could only be told in one way. But at one
Mm.
point, I was sitting there going, do we have this before this? What is the effect of putting this event before this one? Or should we have some more backstory and a few flashbacks before we move on to here? And it's really a real mental gymnastics exercise of just holding all these different iterations of the book in your head. Because I think you've read one version of this book. I know all 27 versions where everything was in a different order, and there'll be tiny micro changes to the overall impression of the book depending on the way it's told. And that
Yeah.
that is the ultimate question of the author and the storyteller, is how do you tell this story?
Mm. And you do that in the book also. I mean, that same idea is reflected in the artist versus the spectator. I think you raised some really interesting questions about what it means to make art at the expense of others. We see that really in Tata, the character, who is this genius, masterful artist. And so since he's such a master at his craft, he gets to be explosive. He gets to, take your dinner plate before you can finish eating because it's all part of the artistic process. He gets to be verbally abusive because the artist needs space to, succumb to his every fleeting emotion and mood because that's part of the process. So I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about what interests you about that idea of this tortured, just torturing artist, and how you knew when you had Tata's character down.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea, this thing of what is the cost of art? Not necessarily the price you put on a piece of art, but what is the cost of everything that goes into it? And there are
Yeah.
several things I find fascinating. So the first is that often if you look at a painting, in a museum, for example, and there's a little plaque next to it, it'll have one person's name on that plaque, and it'll be the person who painted the painting. But there is so much invisible labor that goes into that painting. So if you look at a still life, for example, maybe it's a bowl of oranges. Who went to the market and bought the oranges? Who washed them? Who arranged them in the bowl? Who set the bowl on the table? Who cleaned the painter's brushes? Who set up the entire studio so it could run smoothly? Who was taking care of the correspondence, the children, the meals that needed to happen so this person could work? All of that is uncredited, invisible labor. And I wanted to just shine a light on that. So there's the very mundane drudgery and the domestic side of art, which I think is rarely examined because it's less glamorous and less interesting than this cult and this myth of the great genius with the paintbrush in usually his hand. And then, yeah, there have been quite a lot of books recently about art monsters, this phrase which means these great figures of genius who create incredible works of art, be they paintings or literature or sculpture or music. And we, in a way, give him a free ticket, like a free ride
Mhm.
on being an awful human, because there's this thing of maybe that's just the price we have to pay to have great art. And I was so intrigued by this line of argument, which was, yes, these people are terrible often, and they, abuse the people around them. But that's just the price we have to pay to have great art. And think of all the art we've gained because of this. And like, by not having to feed themselves or do anything for themselves, these people have the time and space to create great works of art. And I was really intrigued that that's the way the argument goes, rather than think of all the art we've lost to these people. The argument is always think of the art we've gained, rather than the art we have lost because the people around these great figures were running around clearing up after them. So I always think about Vera Nabokov, Nabokov's wife. Nabokov wrote Lolita, Pale Fire, great works of literature. But he also used to boast exuberantly that his wife, Vera Nabokov, would lick his stamps for him and fold his umbrella for him. And you just think, I'm sure Vera would have loved to do things with her life beyond licking Vladimir's stamps.
You'd
And
think.
the argument should not be, well, thank God we have Lolita because Vladimir didn't have to lick his own stamps. Why is it not, what have we missed out on? Because
Mhm.
Vera spent her life licking stamps. And I wanted to just turn the argument on its head and say, actually, what could we gain if we looked into the shadow of these great figures and saw who was hiding in them?
And we really see Joseph wrestle with that same question. He starts off as this, this huge fan of Tata's work, and he can't believe that he was invited to his estate to write an article about him. And then we kind of see his perspective of him start to shift over the course of the novel. And I won't say too much more, but he sees the way that Tata treats Eddie. He sees this explosive behavior that is allowed in their day to day. And we really see him wrestle with this and undergo, a sort of internal change of his own. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about finding Joseph's voice and knowing that you also wanted to write the book from his perspective, partly.
Yeah, so I think Joseph enters this house with the reader, which is quite wide-eyed, quite in awe of it, and just delighted to be in, the south of France in the summer. Great, that's really lovely. And I wanted this shift to happen in the novel. I wanted this tipping of the scales where he enters very wide-eyed, optimistic, naive. He's in the house of this great painter. Isn't he lucky? And slowly, the more time you as the reader and Joseph spends in this house, the more you're like, oh, it's something strange is going on in this house. It's actually very uncomfortable. It's physically uncomfortable. I wanted the physical sensation of discomfort to be ramped up in this novel. And it's emotionally and psychologically uneasy and unnerving as well. And I wanted this creeping sensation where the scales fall from Joseph's eyes, and by the end of the book, he's completely disillusioned. And I really wanted to create this sense of the way in which something could begin as a paradise, like an Eden. It's this secluded, beautiful place full of art and light and food. And by the end, it rots and it turns into this poisonous place that you want to cast yourself out of. You are sort of running out of Eden yourself. And yeah, Joseph is a very useful vessel for this because he's so hungry for information, and he's just trying to see things. And I wanted to play a slight trick in the novel, which is that you, the reader, see things a lot of the time through Joseph's eyes, but he's not looking at the right thing. And so you as the reader actually can't see what you're meant to be seeing because Joseph is never looking correctly. And this is why you have Etty's perspective, which comes in, because the novel alternates between Joseph and Etty's perspectives. And when you're in Etty's head, you can see that she knows Joseph is not looking at the right thing. And she's telling you, no, he's not on the right track. He's doing something else. So you, as the reader, occupy this space between their perspectives. And you can see that he's not looking at the right thing. She knows that. And you gradually see that he comes closer and closer to what he's meant to be seeing. But it's only with him that you can do that too. It's, one of the epigraphs of the book is that John Berger quotation, which is we see what we look at. And I wanted the novel to feel like that. I wanted to try and see if I could do that in a novel form. So as a reader, you only see what you look at, but I control what you're looking at all the time.
I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about writing those alternating point of views. Were you quite literally just writing Joseph, shutting the door on him, and then writing Eddie, or was it more of a flow between the two?
It was so much fun.
Yeah.
They really play off against each other, and it's not just like one chapter is told from his perspective and the next is told from hers. I was always very conscious that there has to be a reason that I'm telling you what I'm telling you from one of their perspectives. It can't just be an alternating pattern.
Mm.
So I had to be very careful about what I chose to reveal in each one. And also, often Joseph and Etty are looking at the same thing. And there's a pleasure in showing you from Joseph's perspective and then seeing the same thing from Etty's and going, oh, he missed that completely. And it's really joyous to just weave those tricks in a way. But it also means that there would often be things I knew I wanted to happen in this book, like that raucous dinner party scene.
Mm.
And I would have to decide whose head I wanted to show that scene from, because it's two very different scenes depending on whose head you're in. And every scene, every chapter was a choice in that way, because it's actually two very different depictions of the same event. So always I was saying, well, what do we gain if we're in Joseph's head for this? And what do we gain if we're in Etty's? And yeah, it's was always an artistic choice. And what I wanted from the interplay of their perspectives was that at the beginning, like you said, Etty's very spiky, very reluctant to reveal anything of herself. And some of her chapters are just one line long, and she's just not giving you anything. She doesn't give Joseph anything. But as the book goes on, she reveals herself like those sort of night blooming flowers that just open slowly in the darkness. And she opens herself and reveals more and more of herself, and her chapters get deeper and longer. And slowly it tips more into her story towards the end of the book. And yeah, I wanted this sense of you don't see her much at first, and then at the end, her narrative and her voice and her sight really dominate it.
Did she reveal herself first to you when you started this book?
Yes, she was there, and I knew she had secrets. I had to dig into some of them. And what was fun is that her character was there, and then I wanted a character for her to spark off against. And Joseph is this wide-eyed ingenue is such a great one, because he's kind and he's just trying to see things, and it doesn't work against her very hard shell. He can't really get in there. And I love just weaving their stories around each other and having them play off against each other.
I also really want to go back to language and just what you do with language in this book, because there is one really interesting scene that just really stuck out to me. At one point, Joseph is relieved to read a letter in English, the language of his late mother, and he says that living in and speaking French has felt alienating. And then also we see a scene of him working on his first article, and he's literally crossing out words saying, well, this gives this kind of tone, and I really want to give this kind of tone instead. And we really see like these deliberate word choices. And I wonder what interests you about that and why you included those two scenes.
Well, language is expression, and especially in this novel, it's Joseph's means of expression. And I wanted to hammer home this sense of his alienation in this house. He does not belong here. He is not made to feel welcome. He is a stranger in this house. And this thing of only being able to express yourself in a secondary language means you're not actually expressing your true self. It's very difficult often to fully say what you want to say. I always find this, I never know what impression I have when I speak another language, because my vocabulary is necessarily limited, or the way I express myself is not with, the full depths of how I can do it in English. So I'm always curious as to like, who am I in French or Spanish? Like, I don't know what I'm like. And he has this sheath over him, which is this language, and he can never, fully feel that he belongs in that house. And I do it in lots of ways. So also the scene where he gets horrible food poisoning, it's like he's physically rejected from this house. He cannot even eat the food or speak the language. And then this idea of, sinking into English when he finally reads and writes in English. It's this idea of, when your brain can just stand down a little bit when you go back into your native tongue and you go, oh, okay, I can finally feel a little bit more like myself. And Joseph's anguish in the novel a lot of the time is how to translate a painting into writing. That's another translation that happens. And I love this idea of this translation between art forms, because Joseph is there to write about a painting. And the question is, well, can you do that? Can you accurately portray a painting in words? Because the whole point of a painting is that it's a painting. If you wanted to express the idea of a painting in words, I mean, you don't write a paragraph about it, you paint. That's the whole point. Yeah. So what do you lose in the translation of a painting into writing? And do you gain anything? And how can he do that in a way that conveys what it is about the painting? And the thing about this book is that that's Joseph's quest and his problem. And it was also mine. So a lot of the time when Joseph is there going like, no, I can't say that the paint is frothy. It was just me going, no, I can't say that the paint is frothy. That doesn't work. And I just put a lot of my own personal anguish about how to write about painting into this book, because yeah, a lot of the time I would, when I was writing this book, I would just look at paintings in galleries and museums a lot of the time, and I would try to write about them. And I really quickly realized that the way to do it is not anatomically. It is not to say, there is a silver fork in the bottom left-hand corner and the next to that there's a white napkin, because it doesn't evoke what the painting is. And I had to find another way of doing that. So a lot of Joseph's writing about art is just my own way of writing about art. And I'm really, I'm very gratified that people have said that they can picture all the paintings in the book as if they're real, which is especially gratifying because they are not real paintings. I made them up, and it was a real, mental, exercise of inventing these paintings, holding them in my brain, finding the right words to convey that in language in a way that means another person can imagine that fictional painting that I've made up and is just in my head. So yeah, that translation as well, I find so interesting. And I really do think it tests the malleability and the flexibility of language, which I find so much fun. That's why I love writing, just like choose the perfect word. And a lot of the time I'll just be there for an afternoon being like, pliant, squishy. And just choosing that right word is so crucial. And I always wanted it to feel like every word was a deliberate choice in this book.
I can really tell that this is a book where no word is wasted. That's really one of my favorite kinds of books, where you can really see that the author spent so much time deliberately choosing words. And I mean, I write a lot of copy in my job here, and there's been days where I will spend hours on one sentence because it needs to have a hook. It needs to be just interesting enough. It needs to not give too much away about the book that we're talking about. And it really, really is just a full-minded affair writing these interesting sentences, and you have a whole book of them.
And also, I bet you do that thing where you finally nail that sentence and then you realize you've used the word in the next sentence. And you're like, no, I need to change it again. It was a whole book of that, of like polishing sentences and being like, finally. And that's why I used that example for when Joseph is writing his article and he's like, oh no, I can't use luscious here because it sounds too much like lush in the next sentence. And then I need to do this and then I need to change that. That is what writing is like. It's the constant iterative, erosive process of making sure everything's perfect. And then when you finally think you've done it, you've realized you've repeated something in the next line. But I read this book aloud. After every draft, I would read the whole thing aloud, because when I read, I hear everything in my head, and I needed it to sound good in the mouth and on the ear as well. And also, I think a lot of people listen to books as audiobooks now. So it's also important that that's a good experience, not just an experience for the eyes. So I would read every single draft aloud. And it's such an interesting lesson, because if you stumble on your own sentences, you need to change them. If you can't even get through your own sentence without, tripping on some words that don't quite sound good together, or if the sentence is really long and you can't even get through it, it is a little question mark of maybe that sentence should be changed. And it's a fascinating exercise, because when you read what you've written, your eye will correct things for you. It will make everything nice and smooth, and you will glide over the incorrections. But when you read it, your voice will find everything, and it will stumble on things, and you'll be like, I've got 3 prepositions back to back. How did my eye not spot that? And it's so interesting that your eye will just play tricks on you.
Oh, yeah. And going back to the visual art aspect of this novel, at one point, Joseph is thinking about his mother. And he says the greatest lesson his mother taught him was not to worry about understanding art. She says, don't worry about what it means, just look and take whatever you need from it. Can you tell me about writing that and how you really wanted that to function in the book?
Yes, because I think visual art often feels quite exclusive or lofty or abstract, or people think it's not for them,
Mm.
which is so strange because I don't think anyone ever creates art in the hope that people do not respond to it or that they think it's not for them. It's really odd. So yeah, and I'm aware that I also think people will maybe see the title of this book or think, oh, it's about art, not for me. I'm not interested in that. And I wanted to be a book that says it is for you and you will have a good time here. So art in this book is never academic, it's never lofty, it's never exclusive. And it's really interesting that that's the perception of art, when really art is for everyone. It's for whoever wants to look at it and enjoy it. And I think a lot of people worry when they look at a painting, for example, that they are not appreciating it correctly, or they're not understanding it, or they're missing something. And I always wanted to hammer home this idea that you're not missing anything. If you look at a painting, your response to it is as valid as an art historian's, and how you feel about a painting is the most important thing. And also, no one's going to test you. There's no exam. No one's going to say, actually,
Whoa.
you understood that painting wrong. Art is for you and you can do whatever you want with it. And also, if you go into a gallery, look at a painting and feel nothing, that's completely fine. I think that's what people also get a bit anxious about, which is the idea of looking at a painting, not getting it, not really liking it, not understanding it, and then thinking the problem's with them. It's like, man, move into the next room. There's another painting in there. Have a look at that one. And I really wanted this sensation of art is for you. Bring whatever you want to it, take whatever you want from it. That's what Joseph's mother says. Just take whatever you need from this painting. And if it makes you feel a little bit more serene afterwards, that it's done its job. That's fine. That's great. But it's not like you're going to be tested on the symbolism as soon as you leave the museum. It's not like that. So I wanted that sensation to throw throughout the book. And that is kind of played out because Joseph is trying to write his article about what this painting means and what Tartt is doing in painting it. And he is really trying to crack the secret of this painting. And he says to Etty, well, what does it mean? And she's just there going, doesn't matter. Just look at it. Write whatever you want. Write how you feel. And she gives him permission to be wrong about paintings, which is a really fun strand of the book where she just says, so what if Tartt spends 2 months on this painting, but you said he spends 6 weeks? What would happen? Nothing. And this idea of the myths we create around the art versus the art itself, and actually what is important. And what's important is just the relationship between a person's eyes and the thing they're looking at.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I want to go back to Eddie for a second, because later on in the novel, Tata tells Joseph that women are too unpredictable and they disrupt silence, which in turn disrupts the artistic process. He says you have to keep them under your control. We see this in Eddie, in this fire that simmers between or beneath the surface of her. It makes me think of this poem, Harlem by Langston Hughes, where he says, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and run? We see that alive in Eddie, and it really, I think, determines the choices that she makes in this novel. Can you tell me about writing that repression and resentment in her and just how that made her come alive for you?
Yeah, so I think it's a really powerful thing. And I was really fascinated by the idea of secrecy as power because Etty has a lot of secrets. And I wanted to write a character where her power comes from her secrets. So I think there's actually a lot of power and potential in the position of someone who is overlooked. If you are underestimated and overlooked, you could get away with a lot. You could do things in the darkness because no one is looking at you. Mm-hmm. And this novel was an experiment in what could you get away with if no one was looking at you? Because no one's looking at Etty. Even the reader, you can't really catch sight of her at the beginning of the novel. You can't pin her down. You can't see what she's doing. You can't get inside her head. And I wanted to create this secret world inside her head and in the darkness. And she lives her own life. in that dark space. She has a whole vibrant life that's her own, and no one can take it away from her because no one knows it's there. So I wanted to create this world in which secrecy was powerful, and her whole, that drive, that passion is sustained through secrecy. And I really enjoyed it. And I think this whole idea of, what do we look at? What do we see? What do we miss by not looking at people? And do that at your peril, because Etty is using the fact that she is unobserved and underestimated to, yes, build up this secret life for herself, which will then explode. Mm-hmm. And I loved giving her secrets and just letting them fester.
I'd also love to talk about the time period because it really complements these festering secrets and just the entire setting of this book and the atmosphere of it. You set the majority of the book in early 1920s France, and it's a different 1920s than I think we're used to here in America, at least, which looks very glitzy and glamorous and almost like Gatsby-esque, which we get a taste of when the Americans come to town later. But can you tell me about choosing that time period and why you knew it was the right one for this novel?
So I'm fascinated by contrasts, and I find one contrast really interesting, which is that one you were talking about, which is the 1920s, which we associate with, flapper dresses and martini glasses and fireworks. And the 1920s come right off the back of World War I. Certainly in Europe, that's a really strong sense of the history here. So it's not that they're separate things. They are two sides of the same coin. And the hedonism and the desire for excess and bodily pleasure is a direct response to the decimation of World War I, which is the world has been blown apart. An enormous amount of loss has penetrated people's lives and the landscape. And really, World War I is this erasure of a world that you're never going to get back. The world that existed before World War I is gone. And people emerged from World War I, those who survived emerged blinking. And the question was, well, what are you building in its place? What world are you creating? And this hunt for pleasure is straight off the back of all the destruction, because it's like, well, that's gone. What are we going to do? We're going to have a good time. And I love this duality of, yes, this desire for pleasure and joy and excess against this decimation, and how that is a sort of response to trauma. And I wanted to show how that's a very complicated relationship. It's not like you can just put the war chapter behind you and fully embrace pleasure going forward. That war is going to haunt you, and it's going to come up and rear its head in interesting ways. So I really liked, the duality of that, and playing on those contrasts where, yes, when the Americans come to town, Joseph is like, you can tell these are people who did not recently suffer a war on their continent. They are so much more vibrant and shiny and have so much more energy. And they're not scarred in the same way as the rest of the characters. So I loved, just dropping those people in. That was a really fun chapter. So they come for this dinner party, and it was a way of turning the energy up in the book, because these three characters don't really leave this house. And after a while, I was getting really claustrophobic when I was writing this book, because I was like, we haven't left the house. No, like, it's getting really, really tense. And I wanted an injection of energy and sort of contact with the outside world. But obviously, these people don't leave the house. They can't get to the outside world. So I had to bring the outside world in. And that chapter, it's about what happens when you detonate this bomb of color and riotous energy, and say, what happens if we bring the outside world into the house where it's not allowed to enter? It was that thing of, how do you express that hunger for desire and pleasure against total decimation?
And going back to what you said about them just, it almost feeling claustrophobic because they're just stuck in this house with each other. It is so interesting to me because the book that we see reappear throughout this novel is the Odyssey. And so that's a total, like you said, contrast to what this book is. I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about why the Odyssey and how it really functions in this book for you.
I love that you brought that up. Thank you. The Odyssey was a really fun strand to weave in, because I think a lot of people think of it as an adventure story because it's got these, cycles of, adventure and escapades and escape and things. but the whole shape of the story is about a man coming home. I mean, you've had 10 years of the
Mhm.
Trojan War, and then it takes him 10 years to get home. The whole direction of that story is a man just trying to get home. And I love this idea of, I mean, my novel starts with a stranger comes to town. And it's
Mhm.
this idea of what are we running from? What are we heading towards? And I love this idea of all the homes we are trying to get back towards, and whether that's a physical home or a spiritual home in a way. So Joseph's brother is another character who appears in the narrative, and he's someone who desperately, all he wanted was to get home. And the
Mhm.
home he wants to get to is the same one that Joseph is trying to escape. And Rupert is the soldier returning from war who cannot get home. And Joseph is the one who escaped war and is trying to escape that home. And, Etty is trapped in a home and she wants to escape from it. So it's all about this dynamic between an individual and their home and where are they trying to get to, and the adventures you get to along the way. But also there are so many little symbolic things in the Odyssey that I really like. So Penelope is a character I've always loved in the Odyssey.
Mhm.
And she is, again, a sneaky, subservient, secretive character because she works at night and she creates and then she undoes, she unpicks what she sews. And I love
Mhm.
this character who uses secrecy to, pull the rug out from these men around her who ostensibly have this power in her home. So I love her as a character. And then, I was talking to a friend the other day about the parallels between the novel and the Odyssey, and she just said yes. And Tata is a cyclops with one eye, and Joseph is the stranger in his
Yes.
house. And I was like, oh yeah. So I mean, clearly there is some sort of subconscious relationship between this book and the Odyssey. But yeah, I loved weaving it in. It was really fun.
And also, since this is such a sensory like experience and a gorgeous story that gives us a bit of a mystery, a love story, a historical setting, I'd love to talk about your influences. So I know we have the Odyssey, we have The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Is there anything else like books or authors that really made you into the writer you are today and really impacted this book?
Oh, well, I think as a writer, you're influenced by everything you consume and
Hmm.
read and see, whether you're conscious of it or not, and even whether you enjoy it or not. Even if you read a book and have a viscerally, reaction which rejects it, I think that's doing something. That's influencing you. That's telling you what you don't like or what you don't want to.
Yeah.
So, in a way, it's hard to unpick. I love detail and lusciousness. And I mean, every word in this book is chosen very carefully, but it's not sparse. It's definitely dense with sensation. So, I
Mhm.
love writers who really go in for that. I mean, Donna Tartt is brilliant at that. You know that bit in The Goldfinch where she just describes the antique restorer's workshop? And it's like
Yes.
pages of just mahogany polish and the smells and things like that. Um,
Details. I love details.
mm. So have you read The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock by Imogen Hermes Gower?
I have not. Do I
Oh,
think I need to now though?
it's also historical fiction and it is just dense with sensation. She's
Mm.
so good on like the newspapers they used to curl their hair, these women. And she describes this one character, Mrs. Chapel, as being more upholstered than dressed. I always remember that. So yeah, I love books about texture and detail and sensation. I always love that. Um, I loved when I was writing this, Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin.
Oh yes.
The sense in that book of like this room as a world. I loved that idea because in The Artist, this house is this world. You don't leave
Mhm.
it. How do you create an entire ecosystem under one roof? And I
Mm.
loved that in Giovanni's Room, where the eponymous room is this world. It is it a Marvell or a Dunn quote which talks about making one room and everywhere. That's that
Mhm.
sensation of Tata has reduced his world to this house. And it goes back to what we were saying about control, which is that Tata, this controlling painter, has reduced the world to what he can control. And actually, that's only one house, which is why I do pity him as a character, because he's tyrannical and monstrous, but he can't engage in the world. He can't go out there. He can't exist there because he has limited his life to only what he can control. And that's one person and one house. And what happens when that person becomes unruly and decides that she will not be controlled anymore. So yeah, I love enclosed narratives and narratives dense with description and texture.
Is there anything you're reading right now or anything that's inspiring you right now that you can leave our listeners with?
Ooh, well, I just finished. I don't know if you can see it behind me. Watching Over Her by Jean-Baptiste, which it's originally written in French, but Frank Wynne has done the English translation. It won the Prix Goncourt, and it's really satisfying my early 20th century arty European itch. So it's about a fictional sculptor, and Watching Over Her is of the title is basically, you meet the sculptor on his deathbed in a monastery in Italy, and he's being watched over by these monks. And he's an old man, and he's been placed in this monastery to watch over her. And you're like, who is her? Why is he watching her? What is this monastery? And then again, the power of prologues, it goes back and it tells you his whole life and his relationship with Viola, his friend. And you move through the early 20th century in France and Italy, and it's all about, art and love and life in the early 20th century. So I really recommend that.
That feels like the perfect next step for listeners. So
Yes.
Lucy, thank you so much for joining us on Poured Over. The Artist and the Feast is out now.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.